introduce the next speaker, who is Kristin Magarry, and she'll be presenting a systematic review of digital SEL programs in primary schools.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristin Magarry. I am an industry PhD student who works with Griffith University and CSIRO. And before I start, I just want to say it's so exciting to be here today and to have a chance to present research that I'm pretty passionate about with a group of people who clearly believe the same thing about social change and working to better people's lives. So I am presenting on a systematic review of digital social emotional learning programs in primary school. Bit of a mouthful. So, social emotional learning, if you don't know, is essentially, there we go, thank you. Social emotional learning is essentially some of the major important skills that we need for life, basically. So our ability to communicate with others, our ability to work in a team, our ability to regulate our emotions. These are all really important, and what social emotional learning programs do is they essentially teach these skills, the same way that you might go to a maths lesson or an English lesson in primary school. So in terms of the existing programs, I've got some up here. Those who perhaps come from an Australian context might recognise the zones of regulation. It's a really big one in many Australian primary schools across Australia. And then in the United States, we see some like Second Step or the Paths program as well, which have been running for 20, 30 years. So this has definitely been a very long-term process for many of these programs. So the reason these programs are important, though, is the way that they are able to protect us from the negative impacts of certain situations. So Australia in particular, unfortunately, does have a bullying program problem, and we don't always like to talk about that. So in terms of some of the recent stats, we see that 7 in 10 children report being bullied, and 5 in 10 report bullying others. Actually, according to the most recent statistics, we see that Australia's rate of bullying is 3 times higher than the international average. So it's a lot of children that need help. And we know that, of all things, social emotional learning programs are one of the ways that we are able to protect some of these children from these negative impacts. Now, I hear you asking, how is this relevant to social marketing? Now, I think the first thing is that you consider social emotional learning programs as a kind of behaviour change program. We're really looking at the ways that we can take some of these more negative behaviours, like perhaps lashing out when you're feeling a really intense emotion, and replace them with things that help them cope better with the situation in the moment, like taking a deep breath, for example. And my research in particular is looking at how we can use social emotional learning and social marketing theories to improve the social emotional learning programs and the way that we conceptualize and create them. So in terms of what I'm going to talk to you about today, to start with, I would just like to take you through the context and some of the trends that we see in social emotional learning at the moment. I would also like to take you through some of the research aims of this particular systematic review. From there, I want to take you through the criteria that we used for this systematic review. Then I want to talk about the results. And finally, continuing the theme of this morning and this idea of looking at solutions, I want to take you through what I call the what now, which is essentially now that we have found out some of these things, what should we do about them moving forward? So to start with, let's look at the types of social emotional learning programs. Now to begin with, and this is the one that if you have encountered them, you're probably most familiar with, that is an in-person social emotional learning program. Now, these programs essentially operate by having a teacher see a lesson plan that's been written out for them that structures an in-class activity, and then they will take the class through that activity, and doing that activity is what builds the social emotional skill. Now, this is where things get a little interesting. So what we see more and more now is what we're calling digital social emotional learning programs. And what that means is where there was previously in-class activities to teach these skills, we're actually seeing those kind of replaced or augmented with digital technology. So a good example could be the children might watch a movie or play a game, and they do this instead of that in-class activity. So we've started to see more and more of these digital programs. And then finally, what we see is these hybrid programs. Now these are the newest, and they're definitely the ones that take elements of both the in-person and digital. So they look to have a teacher still facilitating this program, a digital aspect of the program that is self-paced, and then finally they'll do an in-class follow-up. So digital is a very broad term. So when it comes to the kinds of digital programs we see, I thought I would take you through a couple of them. To start with, by far the most common is games. So there's this concept of gamification, right, which is essentially using game concepts in non-game contexts, which is a lot of words to basically say, games are fun. If we make non-game things like games, they will be more fun. So the example I always use is if you have like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or something like that, and you'll get those panicked notifications saying you've got to complete these things to get your badges and your challenges. I know that achiever that I am, doesn't matter if it's 10 p.m. at night, if I get that notification, I will be going for a walk just to make sure I get that badge. That's an example of gamification. We also have video, so this one here is a video from actually an Australian social emotional learning program. The videos tend to focus on sort of social situations with characters that can then provide the content for future discussions in the classroom. And then finally, we're seeing some really interesting things in the VR space at the moment, which are a bit more interactive and other ways to build these skills. So in terms of my specific research aims, we were really interested in knowing, since digital programs are new, what are the programs that are out there right now, and how are these studies in particular, looking at success? What do they consider success? So we wanted to make sure that was all catalogued. And then finally, we were really interested in this idea of implementation. How are these programs actually being implemented in schools? How do they integrate with the classroom environment? That was really important. And so what we found was then we decided to have two research questions, one about measuring success and one about what are the important things that actually influence uptake of these programs in the classroom. So we had to use a systematic review to do this. The main reasons were that we wanted to catalog a lot of information and consolidate a lot of information. We wanted to see a whole list of all the programs that exist side by side. We wanted to be able to identify any gaps or future directions. We wanted to be able to see how this compared to the wider body of social emotional learning evidence. And then we were particularly interested in seeing all of those measures side by side as well. Now, I've mentioned the word implementation a couple of times. And the real question is, why do we actually care about implementation? And you can kind of think of implementation science, which is a different field, so we're getting a little transdisciplinary here, but essentially it's about the gap between what we know works and what actually happens. So it kind of arose out of public health, but the example that I like to use is when it comes to homework. We all know that homework is helpful for reinforcing our learning objectives, but whether it's through ourselves, or our students, or our children, we also know that homework does not always get done. So the real question then becomes, why didn't the homework get done? And so implementation science as a field is all about capturing that gap about why didn't the homework get done? And that's why that's important to this particular study. So in terms of our methods, there's a couple of tables. I made it as small as possible. Stay with me. We started with school students because we were particularly interested in that implementation piece. Additionally, we went 6 to 14 years because we were interested in that primary school area. When we had 6-year-olds and under, that starts to get into that kindergarten space. 14 and over, it starts to get to the average high school space. So we were really interested in that grade 1 to 8. We additionally decided to go all digital components. So while we know that games are most common, there's obviously plenty of insights we could gather from movies or videos or VR. So we included all digital programs. And we were also focused on social skill improvement. So to qualify for this study, just managing, say, one emotion was not necessarily enough. We really wanted programs that focused on improving, for example, all self-regulation or all critical thinking, for example. That meant that we got a lot of program evaluations, a lot of pilot studies, and a lot of retrospective implementation evaluations. We did 3 different databases, and we ended up with a total of about 1,200 articles. So in terms of what happened from there, we ended with about 10 articles that fit that criteria, and then that kind of the information from there went in 3 different directions. So to start with, we took all the demographic information, and that became our study characteristics, so we could see the trends across the field. Secondly, we took the implementation data out of those papers, and then we compared it to something called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which is a mouthful, so we just call it CIFA for short. And essentially, CIFA is a framework from the public health field that has about 60 factors we know affect the implementation of programs in the public health space. So part of this study is we were really interested in seeing if those factors also aligned in the education space. So we compared it to that, and that gave us our factors that influence implementation. And then finally, we took the outcome data as well, and we compared that to see what the general trends are. So in terms of our results, I'll highlight the important parts. In terms of location, we had a pretty diverse spread, which is really good. It means that there's an appetite for social emotional learning pretty much everywhere. We saw that there were a few more studies in the United States. In particular, there was a lot of non-randomized experimental studies. And that's basically because this field is quite new. So while we know that, say, randomized controlled trials might be best in terms of practice, they're also quite time and resource heavy. So we saw a lot of proof of concept, these programs that are just testing these ideas out at this stage. And then by far, as expected, we saw that computer and browser-based games in this field are by far the most prevalent, though there were a couple of video or tablet examples as well. In terms of our outcome measures, there were so many. There was a lot. And so ultimately what we had to do was we actually went to a different paper by Cipriano in the United States. And what she did was she actually designed these categories for the kinds of measures that were being used, right? And so that meant, according to their model, we saw, I think on the interesting side, we saw that social emotional learning skills, and in particular pro-social behavior, or this idea of being kind to others, was measured a lot. But we also saw this massive amount of factors that were not studied at all. And a lot of these were about the environment, the wider environment. So we know that the school climate, for example, has a huge impact on social emotional learning outcomes, and yet we didn't see that measured by a lot of these studies. In terms of some other interesting statistics, we're back to graphics now. We saw that 60% of studies used in-game social emotional learning measurements, so they created their own based on gamification aspects. We saw that there were 22 different measures or questionnaires for the same construct, which is quite a few. We also saw that only 30% of these papers collected any implementation data at all, and only 50% collected any kind of game experience or digital experience data. So in terms of our implementation factors, so this is our research question 2, there were 4. Number 1, innovation design, which is essentially the actual content of the program itself. How does it look? What happens in it? Do the kids find it interesting? That was by far the number 1 aspect that affected the outcomes or the uptake of the program. Number 2 was motivation. So this is where we start to get into the interesting elements of the digital space. Basically, because the program itself is self-paced, you have less control as a teacher, for example, or as a facilitator, over how these programs, how the students engage with these programs. So that kind of interlinks with that innovation design, and if they find it engaging, they will see a better outcome. We also saw opportunity. So this was a really interesting one where essentially the fact that it was self-paced was actually a benefit in a lot of situations, where pretty much if the fact that these students could take it at their own pace, learn it from home, for example, or if they were a little slower or faster than the average student when it comes to reading, all of that was accounted for by the opportunity here. And then finally, we had innovation adaptability, which is basically how well the program can be adapted to other contexts. So teachers really liked, this kind of came out of COVID in particular. Teachers really liked that if it was already a little bit digital, it became easier to teach fully digitally, for example. So in terms of my findings, number 1, too many measures. 22 for one construct is a lot. I've taken here just the construct and the idea of pro-social behavior, and 3 of, 22 that were measuring the same idea, this idea of being kind to others. And while the number of measures itself is not necessarily a problem, it's that they all disagree with each other on what counts as pro-social behavior. There is very little agreement between them, which then makes it very difficult to understand what these key components of social emotional learning success are. So in terms of what we need to do about it, we really need to start working on this idea of the important aspects of the recipe for social emotional learning success. Now, I'm not the best cook, but I do know that there are some parts of a recipe, like the cooking time or the ratios between ingredients, that have to stay the same. And so this is kind of an encouragement, I suppose, for experts in the field who've been working here for a long time, to get them in a room and kind of start to look at what are the essential ideas that we need to have present across these programs and in how we measure them, so we can start to look at trends that are actually going to build from here and be better than what's come before. Number 2, forgetting the classroom environment. So while a lot of these programs sound great on paper, they don't exist in a vacuum. What's happening in the classroom or at home will affect the way these programs actually are integrated into schools. And so it's very important that we saw that none of these particular programs are measuring the school environment at all. They're not thinking about the fact that the classroom matters. And what I mean when I say that is that you could have a really ineffective program in a school that really champions social emotional learning. And it might look like on paper that it did really well. And then in contrast, you could have a program that is quite effective in a school that maybe doesn't have as many resources to put towards social emotional learning. And then as a result, it doesn't move the needle as much as you might think it would on paper. So that's very important. And so in terms of what we need to do, we need to focus on capturing some of these things so we have the whole idea of what's going on. So it doesn't have to be big. It could be just 1 or 2 questions, but I think we really need to focus on capturing some of that school climate, school belonging data when we think about these things as a whole. And then finally, absolute lack of implementation data. So we only had 3 out of the 10 papers even look at these things at all. And so that meant that there were a lot of questions that went totally unanswered when we were thinking about the teacher experience or the student experience. So what was the dosage of the program? How often did they do it? What skill was hardest to teach? There are so many social emotional learning skills. Knowing which ones are more challenging is important. And then finally, did you have issues with the technology or the length of time? If you want to take these kinds of programs out into more rural environments, knowing the technological limitations is incredibly important. And yet we did not see that covered in many of these papers. So in terms of what we need to do, we need to be asking. We need to be asking the teachers, the students, what their experience with these programs are in the modalities that suit them best. Now, we all know that teachers are very overburdened and overworked, so it's important to be conscious of their time. And that's where I think it's important to, on us as researchers, to look at more innovative ways of collecting this kind of data to guide these programs. So in the one that I'm doing with my PhD right now, we're looking at really short voice memos, just what worked, what didn't, what would you change for next time? And then that will hopefully be 3 minutes of their time, but our analysis of that will help guide the program moving forward. So in terms of the limitations, we only took studies from 2016 to 2025, and we know that technology moves quite fast, so that's always something to keep an eye on. We know that grey literature was not included in the screening process, in this particular instance because we were focused on the outcome measures. In terms of the age range, again, we went from 6 to 14, that primary school age, so we know that some interesting things might be happening in the kindergarten space or in the high school space that just aren't covered by this particular context. And then finally, we use 3 databases, so there's always a chance that there's this amazing article that maybe exists in a different one as well, so got to mention that. So then, in summary, we found that there was a real lack of uniformity when it came to the social emotional learning measures. We found that very few studies were looking at this school climate or thinking about the wider environment as a whole. And we found that this implementation data or this idea of it fitting into the larger whole is not focused on by most studies, which means we probably need to start by working towards greater agreement on what the important indicators of social emotional learning success are. We need to be looking at using some of these implementation science ideas to capture the way these programs are being used in the classroom and ways we can improve. And then we also need to be looking into, as these hybrid programs come up as well, more the relationship between perhaps that game, that innovation design content, and the overall experience and outcomes that we have. I would love any questions, if anyone has any. Oh. Yeah, hi. Anyone?
I'm just going to leave just because I'm That was an excellent presentation. Thank you. Very insightful, thought-provoking. I just had a question with regards to getting a clearer picture.
Yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of the studies did not agree whatsoever, so that really prevented be to reduce. So I just wondered if you have considered a meta-analysis.
Yeah, I
Would
think
that
it's
be appropriate
sorry.
as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I think it's great that we're seeing more and more meta-analysis in the social emotional learning field right now. So that's really good in teaching us sort of where things need to go. And it's good to know that a lot of them kind of actually reflect some of the findings of this study around just the massive heterogeneity, I suppose, of all of these different measures in the field. And so I think a meta-analysis will be good, but we don't necessarily have enough yet. So I would be really interested, if anything, I'd be interested in seeing maybe like a Delphi study or something like that, where we're really looking at going to some of these major experts who have been in this field for such a long time. And especially because social emotional learning is such a complex field in and of itself, I'd love to hear maybe, again, some of that qualitative implementation lens as well, which maybe couldn't necessarily just be captured through a meta-analysis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Great presentation, Kristin. I can see that you've got some really valuable insights there, and I also noticed that the team that you had named is very interdisciplinary. You've got social marketers, positive psychology and education, implementation scientists, and you also told us that you are an industry PhD candidate with CSIRO. I want to just hear a little bit more about how you're taking these insights, because you also have an industry partner that you're working with as well. And, you know, for the majority of us in here that have PhDs, we didn't do an industry-based PhD. So it's a very different approach, very different experience. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on how, or what you've learned, those insights that you've got, how you're drawing together two different but similar fields in social marketing and implementation science, and how you're going to draw on these insights that are very academic into practice. Because I think the work that you're doing is really amazing, lots and lots of insights. You're obviously going to develop some sort of initiative or intervention. So yeah, I'd like you to talk us through that. I'm really keen to hear how you're going to actually use those insights.
Yeah, of course. I think that, first of all, the real benefit of the industry layout and setup is I think it comes back to this central idea that we hear, which is like getting more perspectives from different fields is really important. So, for example, we work with a game design company. Without their ideas about how we make this content engaging for our program, then we're not necessarily going to have the same level of pull with the kids. So in terms of the outset, I think what helps is we're using this overall social marketing framework, co-create, build, engage, which is quite broad, but the fact that it's broad is really beneficial because then we can get quite specific in the techniques we apply from other disciplines. So for example, we take this concept of implementation science, all of that, including this study and any interviews we would do, would fall under this idea of co-creation, of gathering this very wide net of data that we can then use to create this program. And it's not going to be purely academic or purely industry. It's kind of a blend of the best parts of both. And I think that's the real benefit of transdisciplinary teams and being willing to look outside your own perspective.
Thank you.
Hello. This isn't really a question, but more so just adding some weight to your findings. It's out of the scope of this exact study, but further to your actual point about bullying being the main focus. I had an experience with one of my daughters in primary school, so your age range with bullying, and obviously spoke to a lot of the other parents that had similar experiences, and the major problem that they talked about was this issue of the school environment. So they have this fantastic framework that says, you know, go through all these stages, which they implement very successfully, and all the kids know this program. They can recite it successfully, but then when they go to, they do get to that stage of speak up when it's got that bad, they find that the support is really not there. The parents find the support is not there. The children tell the parents not to tell because it's just going to make everything worse. So I'm sure I'm telling you everything that you already know, but really just adding weight to that real importance of that massive finding of the school environment.
No, you make a really, really good point, especially when it comes to, like you said, kids not always wanting to talk about these things, and that's a huge part of why the environment is important. When we look at these specific indicators, it's very much, do they feel comfortable telling their teacher what's going on? If they don't, then ultimately it doesn't matter how many frameworks you have. You know, it really comes back again to that very human connection at the heart of these programs. Like, the content itself, I don't think is necessarily ever going to revolutionize anything, but it's supposed to be a starter for these kinds of conversations, right? And create this environment where children do feel comfortable being able to come forward if things aren't going well for them. That's a huge social emotional skill, seeking help. And I think that's sort of where this focus on, I think as well, I didn't touch on it in this speech, but there wasn't a huge focus on parental relationships, which is a huge factor as well. And it's this idea of, and that we found this when talking to teachers as well, that practical element is so, so important, potentially even more so than the theoretical one. And it's this idea of how can we harness these academic findings to make the actual implementation easier, knowing that really what's going to move the needle is fostering a passion for these kinds of projects in teachers, in students, in parents, as opposed to the specific content of the program itself.
Thank you. Great presentation, really enjoyed listening that. I have two questions to ask you. The first one is, when we discuss or when we hear about SEL, what is your perspective on does one size fits all approach? Because I know a standardized approach to SEL may not effectively address the diverse needs of students. So that's my first question. And the second question is, how do you explain or how do you feel, because you've done research, inability to define success in this scenario? Because I'm just about to explain, or about to ask you about, it can be difficult to define success criterion for SEL interventions, making it hard to measure progress. So these are my two questions to you. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, great question. I'm really excited that you asked the first one because it's such an interesting point that it could be its own presentation. So essentially, you're right. One size absolutely does not fit all when it comes to social emotional learning. And I think that's where the implementation aspect is important, right? Because even take the concept of communication. What's appropriate communication varies greatly from culture to culture, from experience to experience. And so there isn't necessarily going to be one program or one content that works for everyone. And I think that's where this digital aspect is quite exciting, because we start to see some ways to personalize the experience for the student. And I think that's, again, where we start to widen the net and look for people with the specific experience to provide, for example, culturally appropriate resources to lead those with, obviously, the resources and support that they need, but then maybe kind of using that digital element as it becomes more sophisticated to create a personal experience for each student, rather than trying to sit everyone, in one room and tell them all the same thing, because that's never going to work. Now, secondly, in terms of your second question, just to make sure I understand it, it's about that it's difficult to define success, right? Yes, absolutely. I think we define success, first of all, it is definitely a challenging question, but I would say, again, it could probably be covered in that sense of that Delphi study, but for me, it would be looking at better outcomes for our students. And again, maybe that's also part of what we would all agree on, but I think we're looking at maybe, more potentially attendance in school. I think we're looking at better. For me, though, I think the most important thing would be better self-perception of social emotional competence. I think that ultimately what you want is for kids to walk away feeling like they can handle themselves in the world and feeling confident in who they are, and not necessarily feeling terrified to seek help. And so I think if you can walk away with these programs giving them a better sense of their own ability to handle things, to me, I would consider that success.
All right. Thank you very much, Kristin. I'm going to wrap up the questions now. Fortunately, we have to keep to time. But I'm sure that we can engage with Kristin during lunchtime and other times. So I'm now going to